At 75, Elton John spoke the name Diana, and then he said the words that stopped the world. She wasn't just a friend. She was my light. For decades, he stayed quiet, afraid and guilty. But now the silence is broken. He's revealing what happened in their final conversation. Why does he believe she was being pushed out? Why did he keep their secret for so long? The press is stunned. The royals are silent. And Elton? He's just getting started. But to understand this powerful bond, we need to go far back. Before the tiaras and the tributes, to the man behind the piano. Before the glitter, the Grammys, and the grand stages, he was just Reggie, a shy boy from Pinner, with a dream and a piano. Reginald Kenneth Dwight was born into a world that felt too small for the fire that burned quietly inside him. His father, distant and strict, believed in discipline, not dreams. His mother, vibrant and emotionally charged, offered little comfort. But it was his grandmother, Ivy, with her warmth and unwavering belief in his talent, who became his first real fan. She bought him his first piano and watched in awe as little Reggie, without a single lesson, began playing melodies purely by ear. In that small living room in suburban England, a storm was forming, a musical genius waiting to be unshackled. Music wasn't just a passion for Reggie, it was his lifeline. Every time the arguments at home grew louder, he retreated to the keys. Each note was a rebellion, a cry for attention, a whisper of what was to come. By the age of 11, he'd earned a scholarship to the prestigious Royal Academy of Music, a place where tradition reigned and rules mattered. But Reggie wasn't built for confinement. He skipped classes to immerse himself in London's rock and blues scene, learning more from the streets than the Academy's lecture halls. He was hungry, not just for fame, but for freedom, a way out of the quiet suffocation that wrapped itself around his childhood. At 15, he joined a local band called Bluesology. It was there, in smoky pubs and echoing halls, that Reggie found his first taste of performance. The shy boy began to vanish, replaced by a persona that demanded to be seen. He wasn't just playing music, he was becoming it. But even then, he knew something was missing. He had sound, he had soul, but he needed words. And in 1967, fate answered. A small ad in New Musical Express connected him with a young lyricist named Bernie Taupin. They didn't just collaborate, they collided. Two creative forces who, together, were unstoppable. Bernie poured out poetry. Reggie brought it to life. They never worked in the same room, never wrote side by side. Yet their chemistry was undeniable. It was time for reinvention. Reginald Dwight shed his birth name like a snakeskin and emerged as Elton John, borrowing Elton from a bandmate and John from a blues singer he admired. Later, he'd tack on Hercules, not because it meant anything, but because it sounded powerful. And that's exactly what he was becoming. Powerful, magnetic, unforgettable. Elton John wasn't just a name, it was an escape, a rebirth, a weapon, a stage persona that could defy every voice that once told him he wasn't enough. As his voice reached new heights and his style became louder, more flamboyant, and unapologetically his own, the world finally began to notice. He wasn't Reggie anymore. He was Elton. And he was unstoppable. But as Elton soared through the charts, another young woman from a royal bloodline was quietly stepping onto the world stage. Born into privilege, but raised in pain. Diana Spencer's early life was anything but a fairy tale. Behind the walls of Park House in Sandringham, surrounded by the traditions of British nobility, Diana's arrival in 1961 was met not with celebration, but with quiet disappointment. Her parents had desperately hoped for a boy to carry on the Spencer name. From the very beginning, Diana was made to feel like she had failed to be what the world wanted, and that unspoken burden would haunt her for years. Her childhood home may have been grand, but it was far from warm. Her parents' marriage was already unraveling, simmering with bitterness, tension, and silence that screamed louder than words ever could. By the time Diana was just 6 years old, the cracks turned to shatters. Her parents' divorce ignited a vicious custody battle. dragging Diana and her siblings through emotional chaos. At first, she stayed with her mother, but during a holiday visit, her father refused to let her return home. He won full custody, with the help of Diana's own grandmother, a betrayal the young girl couldn't understand. The result was a childhood full of shifting loyalties, cold silences, and unhealed wounds. She learned early that trust was fragile and love conditional. And yet, beneath that confusion, Diana's spirit remained gentle. She clung to her siblings, Sarah, Jane, and Charles, as lifelines in a world that rarely made her feel seen. She didn't crave royal titles or attention. She craved safety, simplicity, the ability to care for others the way no one had really cared for her. And slowly, that caring heart began to define her. In 1975, when her father inherited the title of Earl Spencer, Diana became Lady Diana, but the title did little to soften the ache of her past. Even as she walked the halls of Althorp, her family's grand estate, she still felt more like an outsider than a daughter of the aristocracy. What she found solace in was the joy of working with children, those whose hearts hadn't yet been broken. Whether as a dance student in London or a nursery assistant, Diana carried with her a calm, nurturing grace that made people feel safe. She was quiet, often overlooked by the world around her. But that would soon change, because in 1977, a 16-year-old, Diana met someone who would alter the course of her life forever, Prince Charles. At the time, he was dating her sister Sarah. Diana was just a teenage girl, lingering quietly on the sidelines. But even then, there was something about her that stood out: an innocence, a softness, and a light that refused to dim. And as Charles's attention began to shift, so did Diana's fate. But the young woman with the heart of gold didn't just charm the prince. She also caught the eye of Britain's biggest music icon. It wasn't a royal banquet or a charity gala. It was a birthday party that changed both their lives forever. The year was 1981. Prince Andrew was celebrating his 21st, and the palace ballroom was filled with Britain's most powerful names. But among the pomp and powdered wigs, something unexpected happened. As the guests danced and laughed, Elton John, by then a global sensation, locked eyes with a woman who didn't try to impress anyone. Princess Diana had just stepped into royal true life, but she carried none of the airs. No rehearsed smiles, no forced elegance, just a natural charm and a sense of mischief that cut through the formality like a blade. That night, Elton didn't see a princess. He saw a kindred spirit. The connection was instant. In a world where everyone wore masks, they both craved authenticity. As the music played and the drinks flowed, they talked not about fame or royalty, but about loneliness, about what it meant to be loved by millions and yet feel like no one truly knew you. Diana laughed at Elton's wild stories, and Elton leaned in as she quietly shared her fears. There were no royal protocols between them, no rules of conduct, just two wounded souls finding something they didn't know they were missing. That night didn't end with royal headlines. It ended with a bond that neither of them could fully explain, but both instinctively trusted. From there, the friendship deepened in ways few people ever saw. They met in private, away from flashing cameras and royal scrutiny. They dined together quietly. They supported the same charities, often choosing causes that others avoided: HIV, AIDS, children abandoned by society. Behind the scenes, they talked about things no one else understood: the pressures, the expectations, the weight of living under constant public judgment. For Elton, Diana became a safe place. And for Diana, Elton was proof that honesty didn't have to come at the cost of compassion. She admired his boldness. He adored her sincerity. And slowly, they became family not by blood, but by survival. What truly bound them wasn't glamour. It was pain. Both had struggled with identity. Both had fought demons, Diana with her marriage and her self-worth, Elton with addiction and self-loathing. But in each other, they found humor. They found release. Diana wasn't afraid to make fun of herself, and Elton wasn't afraid to cry. And in a world that demanded perfection, their friendship became a sanctuary. Elton often said that Diana had a magic that lit up rooms, But what he never said publicly until much later was that her light often came from a place of deep darkness, a darkness he recognized in himself. But even the deepest friendships can crack under pressure, and Diana and Elton's bond wasn't immune to royal storms. A letter, a silence, and suddenly, the unbreakable friendship was shattered. In 1997, something shifted behind closed doors. What began as a disagreement over a joint charity project spiraled into something far darker, an emotional rift that no one, not even Elton, saw coming. The letter came without warning, cold, formal, and final. In it, Diana announced she could no longer be associated with him. No explanation, no conversation, just distance. For Elton, it wasn't just a blow, it was betrayal. The woman he had trusted, laughed with, defended, and adored had suddenly cut him off, and he couldn't understand why. But as he stared at those words, trying to make sense of the pain, another thought crept in. Maybe she didn't write it alone. He believed someone had gotten to her. That palace forces those who always disapproved of her openness. Her alliances outside the royal mold had convinced her to back away. Diana was being watched more than ever, and her connection to Elton, with his bold persona and relentless activism, made her an easy target. The timing was suspicious. Rumors had begun circulating in the press that she was unfocused, emotional, unstable. The media frenzy painted her as a liability, not a princess. And Elton? He became collateral damage in a larger game. The press twisted the narrative, fueling speculation that something scandalous had gone down between them. But behind the headlines was a far more tragic truth. Diana was retreating into silence. Not out of anger, but out of fear. Elton's pain ran deeper than anyone realized. For years, Diana had been one of the few people who understood his demon's addiction, isolation, shame. And now, she had gone silent. He tried reaching out. A letter, a call. Nothing. The woman who once picked up his phone calls at 2 a.m. was suddenly unreachable. And with every unanswered message, Elton began to spiral. Not back into drugs or alcohol, he had fought too hard to stay sober, but into something more dangerous. Doubt. He questioned everything. Was their friendship ever real? Had he missed signs? Had he said something he couldn't take back? Meanwhile, Diana was slipping further into solitude. She began cutting off more people from her circle, turning inward. Those closest to her said she seemed paranoid, uncertain of who to trust. The pressures of the press, the relentless judgment of the royal family, and the ghosts of past betrayals were catching up with her. She was pulling away not just from Elton, but from the world that had never truly protected her. And just when it seemed like the distance between them would never close, the silence broke. One phone call, one voice on the other end. Diana? Laughing, apologizing, wanting to fix what had been broken. She told him she'd made a mistake, that she missed him, that she still cared. They talked for hours, caught up like old times, and at the end of that call, they made a promise: one more dinner, one more laugh, one more night to remind themselves of what they had. But that promise would never be fulfilled. A buzzing fax, a phone call, and suddenly, the people's princess was gone. It was the early hours of August 31st, 1997. Elton John was asleep when the fax machine jolted him awake. He rubbed his eyes, confused by the sound, expecting nothing more than a tour update or paperwork. But what he read shattered him. It was a message from a friend in London. Diana, Paris. A car crash, critical condition. Then another message, another call. She didn't make it. The woman he had just spoken to days earlier, the one who promised they'd reconnect, who had laughed and said, "Let's make it like old times," was gone. Just like that. And nothing would ever be the same. Elton froze. Disbelief set in. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Just days earlier, they'd laughed like nothing had changed. They had made peace. They had plans. And now, silence. No warning. No goodbye. As the world began to learn the news, Elton was already unraveling. He replayed their final conversation over and over again, clinging to every word, every laugh, every pause. There had been no sign, no clue that time was running out, and that was the cruelty of it. He had finally gotten her back, only to lose her forever. The pain didn't come in waves. It hit like a storm, fast, unrelenting, devastating. Within hours, the world joined him in mourning, streets filled with stunned silence and candlelight. Outside Kensington Palace, mountains of flowers began to rise like soft monuments to a broken heart. People wept openly, strangers holding each other like family. Diana's death wasn't just a royal tragedy. It was a global heartbreak. Elton watched from behind the scenes, his grief cloaked in disbelief. He didn't cry in front of cameras. He couldn't. His pain wasn't performative, it was personal. Every tribute that poured in from celebrities, politicians, and world leaders only deepened the void. Because none of them knew what he knew. None of them had heard her voice just days before. None of them had lost what he had just begun to get back. Then came the call. The royal family wanted him to perform at her funeral. He didn't hesitate, but his heart broke as he agreed. How do you sing for someone you love, knowing they'll never hear it? How do you stand in a cathedral packed with cameras and silence, while the one person who should be sitting in the front row is instead the reason you're there at all? Elton didn't want to sing a love song. He wanted to scream. But he said yes. Because this wasn't about performance. It was about goodbye. It was about honoring the only friend who ever saw him pass the sequins and the spotlight. And what came next wasn't just a performance. It was a moment that froze time and became Elton's eternal tribute. One voice, one piano, 1 billion hearts, breaking all at once. As the organ of Westminster Abbey faded into silence, Elton John stepped forward, shoulders heavy, heart crushed, hands trembling. In front of him sat the world's most powerful figures, side by side, with a grieving nation. But none of that mattered. Because what Elton saw, what would burn in his memory forever, were two boys, William and Harry. Small, brave, broken, walking behind their mother's coffin with a strength they should never have needed. And in that moment, it wasn't about spectacle. It wasn't about music. It was about her, Diana, his friend, his sister, his light. Days earlier, Elton had called Bernie Taupin. There were no grand speeches, just 4 words. We need to write. The song they chose wasn't new. Candle in the Wind had once been a tribute to Marilyn Monroe, a woman adored, misunderstood, and lost too soon. But now, its soul would shift. They rewrote every line to reflect Diana's truth. Not as a princess, but as a human being, kind, flawed, luminous, and fragile. The lyrics poured out like a eulogy, written by a heart in freefall. There were no rewrites, no second takes, just honesty. And when Elton sat down to play it at the funeral, it wasn't performance, it was confession. He didn't flinch, he didn't cry, he simply sang. And with every note, the walls of the abbey echoed with grief. The air seemed heavier. Time stood still. Around the world, over 2 billion people watched. Not just a tribute, but a global breakdown. A collective mourning that surpassed flags, faith, and borders. People who never met Diana sobbed in living rooms and crowded streets, because through Elton's voice, they finally heard what they couldn't say themselves. You mattered. You were loved. And you are gone too soon. The recording of that single moment would go on to sell more than 33 million copies, becoming the fastest-selling single in UK history. Yet Elton never pocketed a penny. Every cent went to Diana's charities, continuing the work she left behind. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about charts. It was about keeping her flame alive, even after the wind had cruelly blown it out. And though the world applauded him for the tribute, Elton felt no triumph. He felt hollow. Wrecked. That song had come at a cost, one he would never fully recover from. But what haunted him most wasn't the applause or the headlines. It was the image etched into his soul, William and Harry walking behind the coffin, their faces frozen, their childhoods fractured. That sight would never leave him. And from that day on, Elton made a quiet vow. Not just to remember Diana, but to stand by her sons, to shield them, speak for them, and make sure the world never forgot who she really was. Because, while millions moved on, Elton stayed behind, quietly protecting her memory. And standing by her sons, Elton lost his friend, but he made a vow to never let her sons face the world alone. In the quiet after Diana's funeral, when the flowers had wilted and the headlines moved on, Elton John stayed. Not for the cameras, not for the applause, but for the boys she left behind, William and Harry. Two sons thrust into adulthood by tragedy, forced to grieve under the glare of a global spotlight. Elton knew that pain. He knew the crushing weight of being misunderstood, misrepresented, and picked apart by tabloids. So he did the only thing he could. He stepped in, quietly, carefully, and made them a silent promise. You'll never be alone. In the years that followed, Elton became a quiet shield, never pretending to replace what had been lost, but always standing in the shadow where Diana once stood. He reached out privately, spent time with them when the world wasn't watching, and offered the one thing no royal protocol could provide: empathy. When the press turned brutal, especially with Harry, Elton didn't stay silent. He didn't play diplomat. He fired back. He called out the press for exploiting Diana in life and now targeting her children. He knew that pain too well, the feeling of being turned into a headline, stripped of humanity, cornered by lies. And he swore he wouldn't let it happen again without a fight. More than once, he stood on global stages and reminded the world who Diana really was. Not a scandal, not a tabloid obsession, but a mother. A woman who had loved fiercely and given endlessly, even when she was breaking. Elton often said the palace had failed her, that the silence inside those royal walls had isolated her, left her defenseless. And in protecting her sons, he was reclaiming the dignity she had been denied. He wouldn't let William or Harry go unheard. Not on his watch, not after what had been lost. But Elton's tribute wasn't just personal, it was purposeful. He kept Diana's legacy alive through action, continuing to raise hundreds of millions for AIDS research, humanitarian efforts, and the causes she had championed. Every performance, every charity gala, every fundraising dinner carried her spirit with it. It wasn't performative. It was penance. It was love. In interviews, Elton would sometimes pause when asked about Diana. His voice would drop. His eyes would drift. And you could tell the wound never healed. But even through that pain, he'd smile. Because knowing her, loving her, surviving her loss, it had changed him forever. He called her brave, honest, funny, and most of all, real. And when he spoke of her boys, there was pride in his tone because he had seen them grow into the kind of men Diana would have been proud of. Not perfect, but human, just like she was. But there was one part of her story Elton had never shared, one truth he had guarded for more than 2 decades. And then came the moment that stunned the world. Elton finally broke his silence, revealing the truth he carried for over 20 years. After 2 decades of silence, Elton John finally tells the world what Diana truly meant and why her legacy can never be erased. In a voice both steady and cracked by memory, Elton didn't sugarcoat his truth. He called her the kindest soul I ever knew. Not the most famous, not the most admired, Antiao, kindest. That word mattered. Behind the designer dresses, the staged appearances, and the endless headlines was a woman desperate to be seen for who she really was. According to Elton, she wasn't just hounded by paparazzi, she was manipulated from within, silenced, shut down, and ultimately abandoned by the very institution that once praised her as their crown jewel. In one stunning revelation, Elton shared that Diana had been making plans, real plans, to escape. Not metaphorically, literally, to leave royal life behind and start over. Away from the palace, the protocols, the suffocating expectations. She had spoken to him about it in whispers. about wanting to raise her boys in a more normal world, about working full-time with charities, AIDS victims, landmine survivors, sick children without cameras and press briefings. She had a vision. She just didn't have time. That's what breaks Elton even now. Because those weren't just daydreams. They were exit plans. And they were real. He remembers those private conversations like prayers. The way her voice would dip when talking. About fear. About being watched. About who she could trust. Elton said she wasn't paranoid. She was perceptive. She knew what was coming, he claimed. She felt it. And still, she was brave enough to try and carve a new path. In one of their final talks, Diana admitted she never felt like she belonged in the royal family. That no matter how much she smiled, she always felt like an outsider. But when she looked at William and Harry, she felt purpose. She wasn't living for palaces anymore. She was living for them. And when Elton called her the only royal who ever truly understood pain, he wasn't exaggerating. He said, Diana didn't just sympathize, she felt for people. She carried their wounds like they were her own. It made her dangerous. It made her powerful. And in the end, it made her expendable to those who only saw strength as control. Elton's words were soft, but his meaning was seismic. Because they weren't just memories, they were indictments. A challenge to history itself. For years, her story had been polished, curated, controlled. But Elton's confession ripped open a different truth. One raw, one painful, one impossible to ignore. And as his voice echoed through the interview, it wasn't just a tribute, it was a reckoning. Because now the world knows what he held in his heart for decades. But what do you think? Could this confession change everything we thought we knew about the royal family? Share your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.